Let's get started. Good evening and welcome, everybody. My name is Dumaresq, and I'm the Special Project Coordinator at the Canadian Automotive Museum in Oshawa, Ontario, which is situated on the ancestral and treaty lands of the Mississaugas of Scugog Island First Nation and the traditional territory of the Mississauga Nation. On behalf of everybody at the museum, including our Executive Director and Curator Alex Gates, who unfortunately can't be with us tonight, I'm very glad you're able to join us for this evening's third Thursday talk as we share Canada's automotive heritage. Tonight, we once again have more than 100 participants joining us from across Canada, the United States, and beyond, and I'm super gratified to see many returning viewers as well as some new names. So before we get going, a few technical details. We're using the Zoom webinar platform. So as a participant, you're able to see us and the presentation, but all of your cameras and sound are off. If you have a question or a comment, please use the little Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If we're unable to get to your question, you can absolutely feel free to follow up with us after the talk using the email you used to register tonight. Do note we're recording the proceedings this evening, and a recording of the talk will be uploaded to our YouTube channel next week with a link sent out in our March e-newsletter. Following this talk, you'll also receive a survey on the event, and as always, your feedback is very much appreciated. So our third Thursday series, that's where we are, if you're wondering by the by, if you're from out of town. Little view of our interior. But our third Thursday series continues on the 17th of March when we head out west to Saskatchewan to learn about the relationship between local First Nations and General Motors in Regina. Dale Edward Johnson will be joined by representatives from both the Star Blanket Cree Nation and the Standing Buffalo Dakota Nation that evening. It's going to be a pretty interesting time. So strong recommend if you're free next month, tune in and join us. Lastly, big thanks to the Ontario Trillium Foundation, Mike Wilson at Haggerty, and everybody who made a donation to the museum as part of your registration. We really appreciate your support. It lets us continue hosting amazing virtual programs like this one. So now it's my very special pleasure to introduce our guest tonight. Samantha George is the curator at Parkwood National Historic Site, also in Oshawa, Ontario. She's passionate about history and the story that material culture tells. She's also very active in both community and international history. She's the Vice President of the Culinary Historians of Canada, a member of the Editorial Committee of the Historic Gardens Review in the UK, and she sits on committees at Toronto's George Brown Culinary School and Ontario Creates. She's also a contributor and/or creative producer for, among others, the CNN, the BBC, the CBC, and the History Channel. So good evening, Sam, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks very much for having me.
So as we begin, a little sort of editorial note for everybody. We're choosing to keep things a bit more fast and loose here than our usual seminars. This is very much more of a roundtable conversation about the life and death, well, 100th birthday and later life of Sam McLaughlin. So if you have questions or comments or want to know more or want to fact check us, both of us were born long after the event we're kind of commemorating this month, which is give or take the 100th anniversary of the 50th anniversary of Sam McLaughlin's death. So we were not there when all of this happened. We are here to preserve this sort of memory and pass on these historical events, but we're still learners too. So at any time, if you have comments, feel free to chime in and we'll absolutely address them. We're looking to do some recalling, some myth busting, some unpacking of historical truths and falsehoods tonight. We've got a lot of cool stuff to cover. But I guess, Sam, let's start with Colonel Sam McLaughlin's 100th birthday. Can you sort of give us an idea of the scope of the celebrations?
Sure. For the city of Oshawa and also General Motors of Canada, they made a big deal of it. And essentially, the celebrations began in the early spring of 1972, and then, and then they went through to the fall. But one of the things, and we'll talk about this in terms of the misnomers, is often Mr. McLaughlin is portrayed as having participated in these celebrations, and unfortunately he didn't. And so here he is. So this is a picture that was circulated for his 100th birthday, and what a lot of people don't realize is this photo was actually taken several years beforehand, and it was kept away, and it was used for this. So he lived a really good, long life, a long time, but he was actually quite ill in his last few years. And so that's why he didn't actually participate. So when you start seeing some of this memorabilia that comes out about his 100th, it actually was pre-planned, should he live that long. And they did have almost a dossier, a folder of things ready to go in the event that they needed it.
Okay. I recall one of the documents you actually sent along to me, and I've got it up on the screen here, is an official GM press release saying he would not be in attendance. There was a lot of press releases going out, but
there were, and that came from General Motors. It came from everything that he was affiliated with. And remember, he sat on all sorts of different boards of directors at this time as well. So he was still heavily involved with Inco, CP Rail, several of the banks across Canada. So Dominion Bank, TD Bank, and they all were doing something to celebrate. TD Bank actually did their AGM at Parkwood that year. And there are some photographs where Mr. McLaughlin joined them for part of the AGM, but he essentially was put into a chair and carried down the stairs so he could be there for the photo op. And then those photos were never made public, just because he was looking so ill.
Okay. So one kind of gets the impression looking back that this was like a massive national event. Was there anything outside of sort of the greater Oshawa region as part of these celebrations, or was this, because they always talk about the international scope of the parade, but it seems like most of the parade entrance came from the area, right?
That's true. I mean, you had members of the McLaughlin Buick Car Club of Canada, for example, who do have membership in and outside of Durham region, but a lot of them are Durham residents. And it's made to feel that it's international scope, but you and I have talked about this several times. We are not Oshawa born, and Mr. McLaughlin didn't resonate in our lives like he did for those that were born and bred in Oshawa through this time. And it definitely was a very Oshawa-centric celebration.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, one of the sort of persistent, I guess, legends about Sam McLaughlin that I've heard a million times in a million different sources, often tied with his birthday, is the famous silver dollar story. This idea that if you came to Parkwood at the right time or for a certain celebration, you would get given a silver dollar. And we actually have the silver dollar here. Can you sort of unpack this story a little bit?
Of course I can. So this was commissioned in 1971 for Sam's 100th birthday. And this was commissioned by the city of Oshawa. So it has nothing to do with the Bank of Canada. It was a city of Oshawa commission, and it was handed out in schools. So a lot of people who are probably on here tonight, when they were in elementary school, would have received this coin. It's not a silver dollar. It has no actual value. It has a historic value in today's world. If you see it on eBay or some like coin collecting sites, it's everywhere from about $3 to sometimes $15. Someone might be able to get away with it. But it definitely has the heritage memento. So often it gets associated with trick-or-treating at the estate. There is no record at the estate that anyone was receiving silver dollars at Halloween. I know there's a lot of memories out there about that, but this coin was what circulated, and it was a birthday celebration. It's also become a little bit synonymous with a belief that it was given after Sam died, that he had left a notation in his last will and testament saying that everyone in Oshawa was going to receive some money from his will. And a lot of young school children kind of equate this with what was given out after he passed away. But this is for his 100th birthday. The reason why I think it sometimes gets mixed up with his death is it was given out the fall of 1971. So it would have been in September, October when people went back to school. And then he didn't live much longer after that. He passed away in the January.
Now we've got Daryl in the Q&A mentioning that he got one in school, and so did, as far as he knew, everybody else in school. So yeah.
And I mean, honestly, maybe, every 3 months I get an email from someone in the general public that's either cleaning out some drawers in their house, or someone in their family has passed away and they've returned to the family home and they're cleaning out their parents' drawers and they discover their coins. And definitely, I would say for your memories and for that historic value of growing up in Oshawa with Sam McLaughlin as being such a huge figure in your life at that time, keep it and pass it down. if you're not going to get anything for it monetarily.
So you mentioned the fairly sort of rapid turnaround, I guess, maybe not the best choice of words, between, on my part, between Sam McLaughlin's 100th birthday and his passing. Can you sort of speak a bit to what he was up to in his final years? He wasn't in particularly good health, was he?
He wasn't. So it's hard to know because it was a private matter. And so there wasn't a lot of discussion. We do know that Sam outlived Adelaide by 14 years. And in a lot of these stories that we hear, he definitely, I would say, became very lonely in the last decade of his life. And you have to remember, he's, rambling around that large mansion that he lived in with some very loyal, very loving household staff who are also aging rapidly and are often not far off his own age. And he was back and forth to General Motors. And so it always depends on who you actually hear the stories from. And this is one of those great things about history, is getting all the different inputs and then kind of creating your own story or version of it. So we have the stories of the domestic staff and what it was like in those last years with Mr. McLaughlin. We do know on his death certificate that he actually passed away from it was old age. Like it's on the death certificate that he was just very elderly, but he also had bowel cancer. So we know in the last year he had underwent several surgeries for bowel cancer. So he was really laid up. But even if you look at some of the photographs that are taken in the late, I would say like 1966 forward, there's definitely, he's battling melanoma. If you look at some of the photos, you can see what's happening with his skin in terms of skin cancer. And he's just becoming a very old man, as you can imagine. He was in his 90s. Let's not forget that he smoked from a very early age onwards. And even though he had a great lifestyle, it did start to catch up to him. He was very proud. We have a lot of stories where he was proud that he was fit through most of his life. But again, in your 90s, you start looking like you're in your 90s. So we have the stories from the domestic staff that kind of tell us what he was doing, rambling around the mansion, seeing his family in and out. I also noticed in our archives in the last year of his life, it's been saved. So I'm not saying that they didn't exist beforehand, but there's a lot more correspondence from the subsequent generation of McLaughlins who were not living in the Oshawa area or even Canada at this time. Yeah. There's a lot more communications with grandfather and great grandfather because, as he's getting older, people know that there's a finite amount of time. Then we have the stories of those that were working in General Motors, and you have both the line workers when Mr. McLaughlin sometimes would appear on the line, and I think that's probably more in the late 50s, earlier 60s, where he would just pop in for a visit. And then we have the stories from the office workers, where in the late 60s, because Mr. McLaughlin was lonely, he would often show up at the head office, and he became the quasi-elevator operator. And so it's actually from General Motors employees from Detroit that would come up to Oshawa for business meetings, and they would get on to the elevator and they would talk to the elevator operator, not knowing who it was. And they would get back out and they'd be like, who's the old guy cracking jokes in the elevator? And it wasn't until they were like, oh, that's Sam McLaughlin. And they realized who they had encountered. So they were narrowing his role at this point where he's just riding the elevator, telling jokes and being sociable. But it definitely is telling, because I think he was a very boisterous individual, that he was friendly. And so he just went out of his way to be at GM, kind of have an idea, feel like he has the pulse of the moment. We also see in some of the correspondence that's left in the collection at Parkwood, where decisions are being made in Detroit or even Oshawa, but they're being presented to him as if he is making that decision. But I think the way it's been moved is decisions were already made, and it was just they were asking him, for his opinion and sign off, but they were going to go a certain way. That's just reading in between those lines.
Yeah, certainly from what we have in our records, he sort of by about 1951, 52, he was functionally really just a figurehead still at GM. He had comfortably retired and divested a lot of the control he had left in the company. So they kept him around, obviously, but he was not necessarily even in an executive position at all.
Well, and you start seeing that he begins to enjoy life even more, right? And I honestly, I do see in the 1930s, we see Sam and Adelaide winding down at the end of the 1930s with a lot of their business, but also some of their social commitments. And the only thing that kind of keeps them around is 1939, when the Second World War breaks out, when they're all they're all of a sudden thrust back into the spotlight of having to use their name, fortune, connections to be able to do things for the war effort. So I do think that then prolongs it a little bit longer. And then you see in 51, he, as you said, it changes for him. And then with Adelaide's death in 1958, it changes again. Yeah. What we can't forget is that in the 1950s, Sam and Adelaide are in their 80s. So it's just that they had such a long life, both of them, that we always think of them as young people. But they were in their 80s when they start thinking, let's start slowing down.
Yeah, absolutely. A couple sort of digressions and side questions. Christine wants to know what the significance of the dates, 1850, 1879, 1924 on the coin, which I must confess, I don't know either, actually.
I don't know. That's actually 1924. There's something to do with the city of Oshawa. We become a city. And I only know that because we're coming up to our 100th anniversary. And there's already started to be some discussions at the city level of celebrating it. So I think if you look back at those dates, they would be significant to Oshawa history. And that's the Oshawa Museum could help you with that.
I believe the incorporation of the city as a formal village was about 1848, 1849-ish. So that's a very good question, Christine. We'll have to strong recommend follow up with the Oshawa Museum. I'm sure the answer to this is very obvious, but
yeah, they'll just rhyme it off.
Yeah. Oh yeah, Daryl confirms. Yeah, Oshawa was incorporated in 1924. So okay, yeah. That raises the question of what the 1879 date signifies, but it's a good question. Now going back to the World War II stuff, because this is one legend I have heard. Is there any evidence that Sam McLaughlin was in correspondence with Winston Churchill in any capacity?
Absolutely none. And I think if you really start breaking that down a little bit, you'll realize that it's a little bit of a stretch. Clearly, Winston had a lot of things on his plate. Mr. McLaughlin was active, but I don't feel there was never any sort of communication between the two.
Okay. Oh, Jill is saying 1850, 1879, and 1924 are the incorporation as a village, a town, and a city, respectively.
So shout out Oshawa Museum. Thank you for that answer.
Okay, so I guess sort of the obvious next step is to move on to Sam McLaughlin's passing. And before we go on more, just to get an idea, because we have a fairly large crowd in attendance, we put together a little poll that I'm going to send out. Were you in attendance at Sam McLaughlin's wake or funeral in 1972? Anybody in the crowd? Go there. If you were, oh yeah, we've got a few who are there. You may see yourself or people you know in pictures. We've got a fairly good collection of photos from the, well, especially not so much the funeral, but the wake, certainly. But tell me, Sam, what do we know about sort of Colonel Sam's last few days? Because we certainly have.
There's often a portrayal that when he passed, it was a little bit of a shock. As I just mentioned, he was ill, and there was the plans on these photographs that were taken while he was still healthier to be used. So it was not a shock to those that were near and dear. And it certainly was not a shock to those that were visiting Parkwood. And thanks to a wonderful oral history that we were able to collect from Donna Bradley, and I suspect she's probably on here tonight. Her mom was Velma Allen, who was the final cook at Parkwood. And we have the oral history where Sam asked for his final meal. And his final meal was Velma's famous apple pie. But he wasn't able to actually consume it. He couldn't chew, and even swallowing was difficult. And so they blended it for him. So he was able to sip it through a straw. So although it may have been a shock to many in the city when it did finally happen. Again, he was in his 101st year, but it wasn't for those that were around.
Okay.
And we certainly see that. And as we move forward, we're going to talk about some of the celebrations of life and the funeral plans and how quickly some of those came about.
Yeah, that's something that really got to me. So you mentioned visitors to Parkwood. Now I know it's fairly clear his daughters weren't really present for his 100th birthday. Who was he, other than the staff, sort of who was he spending time with in his final days? Like who was in town saying hi to Sam?
Well, so the family did come in September of 1971 for a family tea for his 100th, but it was private.
Yeah.
So they did. So we had the family from the United States, we had family from Montreal, we had family from Toronto that did come out for his birthday. But we did, so Isabel would have been around the most in terms of the actual daughters because she lived the closest and she was downtown. But then it was just other people that he was friendly with. And so there would have, some of the higher, like folks from the Masonic Lodge would have visited. Obviously, there were doctors in and out. There was nursing staff. And you have to remember at this point, Sam McLaughlin also has a permanent nurse on his staff. And she actually, Margaret Nelson, joined the Parkwood staff for Adelaide. And then when Adelaide passed, Margaret actually never left. She continued, again, because recognizing that Sam was now in his mid to late 80s when Adelaide passed away, she just kind of stayed on for the next 14 years.
Okay, wow. That's quite the career.
Yeah.
So we have a comment for Rob, who recalls hearing at the time, rumors at least, that the city of Oshawa had kind of done a lot of pre-preparation for an eventual McLaughlin funeral. Obviously, the guy was over 100. Of course, it was coming down the pipe at some point. But do we have any sense that this was sort of something that they were waiting to push the button on?
Nothing that we have at Parkwood in terms of documents, but it wouldn't be surprising. I mean, like, we know that the royal family, for example, there's always those plans are set in place. So I think the city, if they were on the ball, they would have been ready. And again, I think we do see that in terms of how quickly things do turn around. Yeah.
So you mentioned the fairly fast schedule. So we don't really have much of a formal schedule of events, right? Like we know the rough sequence of when things happen. We passed away at 2 or 3 in the morning on the 6th of January, and then things happened very quickly after that. But sort of, I guess sort of the natural transition would be telling about the laying in state, because that's probably the most public part of his death that many would remember.
Definitely. So this is done within 2 days of the actual passing. So I think I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but the first formal recognition of his death is actually at the Masonic Lodge.
Mm-hmm. We have, skipping ahead, spoiler alert, skipping ahead some stuff, but we have, his Masonic funeral service.
So this is within a day, right? He passes away on the 6th, and by January the 7th, there is you have a published program, and they actually have the program in place for his funeral service. So again, there are no details of this. It's just we have this within the archive at Parkwood with about their celebration of his life.
Mm-hmm. So as we sort of go through and talk a bit more about the cortege and the laying in state of the army, I put it to the crowd, those of you who do remember it, and those of you who are in attendance. I'm seeing from the poll there are at least 2 of you who attended either his wake or his funeral. Please, what do you remember? Tell us. Where were you when you heard about it? What was your reaction? Because the impression one gets from all these photos, I mean, it was like early January, and the weather doesn't seem to have been great. Everyone looks pretty, if I'm being honest, pretty cold and kind of wet.
Well, and in typical historian style, when we were meeting to talk about this, we actually jumped ahead and looked at Environment Canada, and we looked back to see what the weather was that day. So we knew that it was quite chilly, but it was windy, right? That was the one thing that really stood out. So it was a biting wind that everybody was standing on the streets.
Yeah, a wind chill of -18 is what I have in my notes here. So yeah, not a great day to wait outside in line outside of the city armory.
Especially in those early 1970s miniskirts that you can see in the foreground.
Absolutely, a lot of those in the crowd. Do you have a sense of sort of whether or not there was any kind of official announcement from GM about this? Because obviously there was a lot of press from them around his birthday, but did they do much around his death?
Not that we have in the archive. That might be something if someone is really keen to look at that. Obviously, there was communication that went out, but it would be interesting to see what the CAW magazine at the time would have carried in subsequent editions and weeks about that. And that would also give you a really good indication often of the way it's written, their feeling towards the McLaughlins, because we know that it ebbed and flowed over the years, as it does with labor. And so that it would be, if any of the keen historians out there are interested in taking a look at that, I'm sure some of you have those editions.
Yeah.
Of course, we don't have those at Parkwood. They don't exist in the Parkwood archive.
Yeah, the Automotive Museum, we have the collection of the local women's auxiliary, their big archives of stuff. And I don't recall, I haven't gone through it extensively, but I don't recall his death being mentioned as a sort of notable event in the women's auxiliary archives. I mean, maybe just, again, because all this happened within 48 hours, it may have been sort of too brief to organize anything serious about. But we do have some comments, I believe, from possibly our two attendees, Daryl and Barbara, who both remember the open casket, and in Daryl's case, at least the first time he had ever seen Sam McLaughlin in person, I guess. And Barbara says, I remember seeing a very small man in what seemed like a huge casket, as well as actually the honor guard. And we have photos of the Ontario Regiment's honor guard. So, I mean, clearly this is a fairly military affair, given that he was the honorary colonel of the regiment.
Yes, yeah. And so they definitely had a very large part at the armory. But you do actually start to see that as we click through the other photographs of the organizations that he was affiliated with. Yeah. So if it's the St. John's Ambulance, or often it's a Salvation Army band, are playing at different times. Sometimes you'll see the Boy Scouts and the Girl Guides, as they were then, doing their honorary guard or processions. There's definitely a presence of all those community groups that Mr. McLaughlin was involved with.
And I believe his medal set is still on display at the Regiment Museum, and it's almost entirely civilian medals, obviously, because he was not a formally serving soldier. He was an honorary colonel, but it's quite an extensive medal set. I mean, as we can see from the photo, yeah,
and his Order of Canada is at the museum as well.
Daryl, again, is remembering that the honor guard was quite impressive. And I don't know if they're in attendance, but we had at least one person, when we posted this photo as our ad photo for this event, we posted it on Facebook, somebody was able to identify basically everybody in this picture. And I believe a lot of them are still around, and some of them are obviously still serving with the regiment. So if anybody recognizes the people in this photo, please tell us more.
Yes.
I'd love to hear your story.
Yeah, because this is one of the things, is we have the same photo in our archive, not colorized. We have it black and white, but often it's the other people in photos that are never mentioned. And I have a lot of photographs in our collection that say "man with hat." And so as we try to identify who man with hat is.
So another thing, just not planning this on purpose, but the thing that really stands out to me is the number of scouts who are at his laying in state, or the procession. Can tell me more about the scouts connection, because there were clearly a couple full troops of scouts here. Is this something to do with Camp Samak?
It definitely does. It's Mr. McLaughlin and Adelaide McLaughlin were huge advocates of both the guiding and scout movement, being very friendly with the Baden-Powells. So when Lord Baden-Powell was in town, he would often stay at Parkwood, and he would come for ceremonies. But also with the creation of Camp Samak, is named after, I'm not sure everyone attending tonight knows this, but Sam McLaughlin. So there definitely was veneration, because where they would go for all their scouting and guiding needs in terms of overnight camps, doing all their different badge work, would have been because of Sam and Adelaide gifting those items. So I talk about Camp Samak because that's local, but those of you that were in the guiding movement and may have stayed at Camp Adimac or Camp Adelaide in Halliburton, those are after Adelaide McLaughlin. So you can see that they were very affiliated. And of course, I cannot forget Guidehouse, which was in downtown Oshawa for many years, and just recently is no longer part of that collection.
Grace is wondering if there was any given that, I mean, in a lot of these photos, we see lots of kids and families in attendance. Was there any kind of days off of school to allow people to attend, or was this just a, show up if you can make it kind of a deal?
Not officially. And I think Barb, who's jumped on a few times, is actually one of my volunteers.
Thanks, Barb. Hello? Oh, we seem to have lost Sam briefly. I'm sure she'll be back on. Yeah, in terms of the, we have some great photos. All of these pictures, incidentally, if you're wondering, are from the Parkwood collection. Regrettably, the Automotive Museum, we don't have a ton of material from Sam's personal life, but Parkwood has all these great snaps and some, again, really excellent oral history material that they have around. Just wait for Sam to come back on. Oh. Any sign of her? Yes, if you can identify anybody in these pictures, please let me know. I am of Ottawanian extraction. I don't know much about the local history of Oshawa, but I'm learning. But I believe we have, representatives of the regiment, and I'm fairly certain this picture is a great many of the General Motors lifers. By the 70s, most of them were retired, but there was a solid core of, give or take, I think sort of 30 or 40 guys who had 45 to 50 plus year experience with General Motors, and who had been sort of repeatedly recognized by the company over the years. And they often showed up front and center in General Motors Canada advertising. Oh, you're back.
That was really weird.
It happens.
Am I back?
You're good.
Okay.
You're here.
I had to log off and log back on again. So where did we get to? We were talking about
for students, and you said not officially.
Yeah, and I saw Barb jumped on before I got thrown off. There was not an official closure, but I think if you were passionate about Oshawa history, often the kids were taken out of school. Some families did, some families didn't.
Yeah, and I think we have actually some photos of kids. Yeah, there were some archival photos of kids clearly assigned some kind of eulogizing or scrapbooking activity on Colonel Sam in school. We've got a couple photos from, I don't know which public school or which class, but kids clearly working on some kind of write about the life of Colonel Sam assignment that was off the cuff.
And you know that this was done. I mean, those of us that are old enough to remember the '88 Calgary Olympics, like a whole entire month was dedicated to Calgary Olympics and Olympic projects. So you can see how that would have been something big amongst local schools.
Do we actually know the specific dates for his laying in state? Because Daryl's again pointing out that the 8th and 9th of January 1972 were a Saturday and a Sunday.
Yes.
Extended that far, theoretically, people could have made it, or kids could have made it.
Yeah, exactly. And then I believe the funeral was pretty quickly after that, the Monday.
Yeah. Okay. Barb, keep them coming. Barb is wondering who handled do we know who handled the arrangements for the funeral and sort of the memorial process?
Absolutely no idea. That's a great question, Barb. It may have been either one of the local funeral homes at the time, but I don't know who secured that contract.
Now, obviously, we don't really have photographs from the funeral or the interment or anything like that. It's a private event. But other than Hilda, Eleanor, and Isabel McLaughlin, who we do have pictured here, who was in attendance? Any sort of, Sam McLaughlin was obviously a fairly major Canadian public figure at the time who knew a lot of important people. Who's the who's who at Sam McLaughlin's funeral?
Well, the people that would have jumped out, definitely locals would have recognized some of the General Motors executives at the time. But the big celeb, if there was a celebrity that was attending, would have been an elderly A.Y. Jackson. And I believe we have a photograph of him with Isabel. So A.Y. was was a good friend of Isabel's from the 1920s forwards and spent quite a bit of time at Parkwood. And we do know that he would come for dinner with Isabel. And it's funny because in the conversations that we've had with various people over the years, especially domestic staff, often when Isabel was bringing any of her artist friends back for dinner, there was often the conversation like, oh, the Bohemians are coming again. And what are they going to want us to buy this time? So those of you that know that Parkwood had an extensive Group of Seven collection, Group of Seven had to start somewhere, and often it was before they were famous. And so Mr. McLaughlin was hugely supportive of the arts. And so he would often say, bring what you're working on. And that's how it ended up in the collection. And we also know that that continued with some of the other families. So Eric Phillips and Eileen Phillips, so Eileen McLaughlin Phillips, they actually purchased a lot of the early Group of Seven work. And one of the things that when the Bohemian friends would come for dinner, often Adelaide would find herself busy elsewhere. She wasn't necessarily fond of maybe some of the conversations that were happening around the dinner table.
Seems hard to imagine, as distinguished a Canadian art figure as A.Y. Jackson being a Bohemian, but I guess,
Yeah. But so, because Barb keeps making comments, I'm going to open it up to her for a second, and she can tell you about her memories of seeing A.Y. Jackson on the television attending the funeral, and just what her response was when she saw him.
As Barb is typing, we have some comments from Daryl, who apparently says that Louise Parks heard from Debbie Armstrong at Armstrong Funeral Home that Armstrong was initially tapped to do the McLaughlin funeral, but it ended up being Macintosh Anderson who did the ceremony instead.
Okay. All right.
For whatever reason. So
yeah, I figured it was either one of them two, and that's interesting. So I will have to bug Debbie about that and find out if we can find out what happened.
Yeah. So we have sort of some ephemera from his funeral. We obviously have the Masonic ritual, but we have the text of the eulogy by the. Well, it's interesting because it's sort of a eulogy quoting Leonard Brockington, who's a fairly notable Canadian legal figure and not necessarily politician, but political advocate. But we know, sort of a little bit about, or through this insight, a little bit of the content of the funeral itself. Can you tell us anything about the actual funeral cortege or anything, passing through the city? I'm assuming, street closures, big parade of cars, given the scale of this event, but do we have any records of that?
We don't really. All we have is by able to put together between the oral histories of people who tell us the stories about lighting the streets as the cortege moved from the Armory to what was St. Andrew's United Church, which was Adelaide's favorite. That's the church that she attended. Sam was not really a church guy. He would attend when he was kind of forced to, but it wasn't something that was on his radar every week. So he was buried from St. Andrews, as was Adelaide. But we do know that there was a cortege and there was the parade of cars, but we don't know much in terms of the detail. When you take a look at some of the photographs of what looks like to maybe be some of the people that were selected to be pallbearers, looks like it's a lot of family members. So some of them are the sons-in-law, some of them are the grandchildren if they were able to return. Now, a lot of the grandchildren didn't actually make it back to the funeral just because they were spread all over the world, and it did happen quite quickly. So again, those of you that you can identify people in there, you're going to see some of like the leaders of the Oshawa Council, you're going to see Rotarians, you're probably going to see Masons, and you're definitely going to see family members.
So Barb is saying she saw brief coverage on CFTO of the funeral, mostly guests filing into the private service. Yeah. A.Y. Jackson standing out as he was in a wheelchair and dressed in a Cowichan knit sweater and a matching toque. Yep. Very casual, but very warm. Makes sense. It was cold that day. I think actually on the funeral day itself, we have the weather forecast for there. Just below freezing, but quite damp. So again, not great weather on either occasion.
So there is an example of where oral history and memory is really, really important. So we have the photograph of A.Y. Jackson in his outfit, his chosen outfit for the day, with Isabel. And they're sitting and they're chatting, but I had no idea he was in a wheelchair. So that is the kind of information that when we can gather from the public, it just helps tell future historians more about the day. So those are the sort of things a lot of people think, well, that's not important. I don't need to tell you, but it is. It's something that helps round out those stories.
Yeah, for sure. Especially for something like a private event where we don't have a way of seeing inside. We don't have video footage. We don't have photographs because they weren't taken. Or any kind of remembrance that allows us to piece together that is really valuable. So I guess that sort of allows us to naturally segue into talking about kind of Sam McLaughlin's legacy and how Oshawa moved on or didn't in many ways move on from his passing. Because I know as somebody who's not from Oshawa, one of the things that really struck me when I first started working in the city was I had no idea who Sam McLaughlin was, and B, as I learned who he was, I realized how much of the city is sort of named after him or members of his family. Like the McLaughlin name is still very much around in Oshawa, and I wonder if you could sort of speak to maybe this is harsh, but the almost sort of hagiographic treatment he's got as sort of the patron saint of Oshawa, the car city.
Well, it's interesting because, and we have talked about this offline, about we were trying to think of any other community that we know that someone has such a presence, and we weren't able to come up with something like that. Now, it is interesting, and I think a lot of the attendees tonight and the age group that they're going to form are going to be part of that legacy. Now, speaking to that, and you saw mentioning about how everything is named after the family, it's changing. And the best example, and those of you that have attended things that I've done before know that in the last 10 years, I've attended talks at both Adelaide McLaughlin Public School and R.S. McLaughlin High School. And I can tell you their student bodies have absolutely no idea who Adelaide and Sam are. And that is actually why their teachers and principals keep inviting me back to speak to the different generation. And that's just because he's not, Sam in particular, because Adelaide's now been gone for so much longer, he's not part of the dinner conversation like he was when a lot of you were growing up, where it was such a huge part of your life, either being the GM picnic or something that was happening at General Motors, the Oshawa Generals. He's fading from the collective memory in terms of dinner time conversation. And a lot of the young school kids that are going through don't have things like Guidehouse, Camp Samak. If they do attend, and we know that scouts and guiding movements are not as robust as they once were, it's just not part of their daily lives. So when I attend these, the student bodies actually think Sam and Adelaide McLaughlin were their first principals. And their teachers are like, there is portraits of them in the front hall. And they're just, it's not part. When they refer to the Oshawa Library, it's no longer the McLaughlin Public Library, it's the Oshawa Library. So the name has been dropped. So there is that disconnect over the different generations. Some people are absolutely aghast at that idea. But there are a lot of people who would argue contrary to that. And when Mr. McLaughlin in 1951 started his McLaughlin Foundation, one of the things that he stated was that he wanted it to end in 2001 because he felt that in 50 years, Oshawa and Canada shouldn't be talking about McLaughlin any longer. So he felt like the community needed to move on. And so there is that argument about the patron saint of Oshawa, but I definitely think it is certainly generational. And I think you will see that it changes. Now, part of my job in terms of his legacy is making sure that the Parkwood story and his domestic story doesn't fade, as the Oshawa Museum does for Oshawa history, and as the Automotive Museum is going to do about automobiles and the Canadian General Motors story. But I think you're going to see the change in generations.
Yeah.
But it will be interesting to see what some of our attendees would say tonight about their children and their grandchildren moving forward, how they're trying to keep the legacy alive within their own homes.
Now, speaking of, you've actually segued very nicely into a comment that Rob brought up earlier, which is the something that was apparently, I hadn't known this at all, taught in schools for Sam's 100th, the famous or perhaps infamous Ballad of Sam McLaughlin, which I regret that we know very little about in terms of, I have scoured music records to learn more about Ron Farrow, the guy who wrote and recorded it, or much about Canadian Talent records for that matter. But not only do we have the lyrics, if people are willing to enjoy some cheesy 1970s folk music, we have the entire song, which I am prepared to play for you. So please keep bringing their comments, but I'll take this moment to tune in to the delightful Ballad of Colonel Sam.
Started building carriages in a place called Editorial. Colonel Sam McLaughlin was his name. With a father there to guide him and to learn young Sam was willing. Hard work there brought young Sam great fame. Colonel Sam McLaughlin was his name. Colonel Sam McLaughlin was his name. They moved into the city to Oshawa they favored. His father, Bob, and brother George and Sam. He took up his apprenticeship, many hours city labor. Hard work later brought young Sam great fame. Colonel Sam McLaughlin was his name. Colonel Sam McLaughlin was his name. In December 1899, disaster struck the factory. Fire burnt the plant right to the ground. Temporary establishment in a place called Dumaresq to fill the orders keep McLaughlin fame. Colonel Sam McLaughlin was his name. Colonel Sam McLaughlin was his name. New Era came the motor car, people traveling near and far. Sammy thought this was the latest game. They changed the name from carriages to McLaughlin Buick motor car. Hard work later brought young Sam great fame. Colonel Sam McLaughlin was his name. Colonel Sam McLaughlin was his name. He lived to be 100 years, donating his fame and spreading cheer. His name will always be well known by all. The famous Buick motor car is taking people near and far. Hard work now has brought young Sam great fame. Colonel Sam McLaughlin was his name. Colonel Sam McLaughlin was his name. In January 72, that news came to me and you. Colonel Sam McLaughlin passed away. On the 6th day in the early morn, Parkwood House was so forlorn. His life has come to end, but still there's fame. Colonel Sam McLaughlin was his name. Colonel Sam McLaughlin was his name.
Anyway, you get the idea, but it's quite the song. And Rob's actually mentioning that apparently there are two different songs about Sam McLaughlin, that apparently for his 100th birthday, they learned in school a very different song explicitly about his birthday, but he doesn't remember the full lyrics. Yeah, it's sort of a full song about his life history. Barb's speculating against maybe a distinct East Coast accent, so maybe somebody in the East Coast. I have looked high and low. I do not know who made this song or the context of it, but it's a fascinating little cultural artifact.
It really is, because I mean, clearly the man commanded 2 songs to be written about him.
Yeah.
It was like, yeah. I hope that we all have that in life.
So going back to the sort of talking about his philanthropic works and sort of the how many things were named after him, I guess. Can you speak to his involvement in the planetarium at the ROM and a bit of the backstory of that?
Certainly. So Mr. McLaughlin actually is on the Royal Ontario Museum board very early on. And it's like a whole other hour discussion. But Mr. McLaughlin used both the ROM and the art gallery, among many other, when I say art gallery, I mean the AGO, as stepping stones, his ladder into the Canadian establishment. Again, those of you that have attended my talks know that Adelaide and Sam were not well accepted by the establishment. In some cases, they never were. In other cases, they were allowed in. They were allowed into play once in a while. But so he was affiliated with the ROM very early on, definitely through finances. Not-for-profits, charities are always looking for great patrons and donors to help with collection. Like a lot of people throughout the world, Mr. McLaughlin was fascinated in 1922 with the discovery of Tutankhamun. And he actually even had a little bit of his own Egyptian collection for a few years. And it was just through interest that he would start investing and putting money into the ROM. And then eventually when the planetarium came around, of course, that definitely would have been, his appetite would have been whetted by the moonwalk and just interests like that. In terms of anything educational, there's certainly the influence of Adelaide McLaughlin in behind all of those. And that's because she was actually a school teacher. And so when we see any monies going towards anything that had an educational bent, you definitely see that Adelaide was pulling the strings for those. So that is like a long way to explain his affiliation with the planetarium. Of course, it was the biggest donation, or it was a donation that had stipulations attached that it be named after him. So for many years, as everyone knows, it was McLaughlin Planetarium.
And is the McLaughlin Cancer Center at Lakeridge also, is that a McLaughlin sort of trickle down thing?
It is a trickle down thing. So that is the last donation made by Sam McLaughlin's money. So that comes from the McLaughlin Foundation. So in 2001, so when I mentioned that he created it in 1951 with the stipulation that it comes to an end in 2001, there were monies left over and they were dispensed, and Parkwood received some, the Cancer Center received some, but the biggest donation of that year was about 55 million to the University of Toronto.
Wow.
Yeah.
From what I've read, he seems to have been almost kind of competitive with some of his donations, where people would donate sums and he'd try to one up them. Do you have any sense of that? I've just seen quotes of him saying like,
yeah.
I gave them more than $75,000. Would that make me look chintzy, or should I go higher than that?
That was definitely his way of doing things. And I mean, people would seek money out. We have in the collection letters that were written from like Joe Public to actual fundraisers, fund development officers who were looking for money from Mr. McLaughlin. And we do have wonderful analogies where he asks, well, how much is, Mr. So-and-so giving? And then there'll be an answer. Or we have this wonderful analogy, and I can't remember the actual charity, but they came to request money to start something up. And he says, who else is giving to you? And they said, well, Mr. Smith, for example, of Montreal is giving me this much. And Sam's like, oh, really? Picks up the phone, calls the club and says, I hear you're giving so-and-so this much money. Is this true? And yes. Okay. So he would up it. And then after he would say, if you had asked for 100,000, I would have given you 100,000. So it's one of those things. I mean, and anyone who's in fundraising knows that game and knows often if you don't ask big right out from the start, they're going to go with a smaller donation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we've got some more sort of memories.
Yeah.
Big one being Sam driving around Oshawa regularly and sort of being visible in public in big fancy cars. That I've definitely seen stories of that. He seems to have been quite the the pleasure motorist when he couldn't, ride in a carriage. Yeah.
Certainly was. Now, so that is an interesting memory. And one of the things that I'm going to say is the man had 3 chauffeurs. So how often was he actually driving himself around, or is the memory of a chauffeur driving the car? And it's, again, depending on oral histories, is you hear, from chauffeurs one thing, but you might hear something different from the public who are seeing people. Mm-hmm. Now, was it just an older gentleman driving what is known as Sam McLaughlin's car? Mm-hmm. That's the other thing we have to start thinking, and that is, in history, we do call them false memories, in that, especially when you're a child and you see something, how it does over the years become something that you'd be like, no, for sure, it was Sam McLaughlin driving. And it may have been. We do know that he did drive once in a while, but a lot of the times it was the chauffeurs.
I'm seeing just a digression, a couple questions. First off, about Sam's first car. As far as I recall, it's an Oldsmobile, I believe, that he picked up in the United States and was quite taken with.
Yes, but I have that same story too.
And he didn't.
Again, that's a memory. So I don't know how truthful that is.
And somebody else is wondering, sort of whether there are similar archives. Oh, sorry, Daryl is wondering if there are similar archives for George McLaughlin, his brother, and I get the impression there aren't. Right?
Well, yeah, so George McLaughlin's archives do live with the Archives of Ontario. His family donated those. So one of the things to remember about George McLaughlin is he passed away in 1942 in his 70s, but Sam McLaughlin just lived so much longer. So that's why he is in our living memories longer than George. Also, the other thing to note is George retired from General Motors in the 1920s and decided to retire and go and spend a lot of his time leisurely, a lot of time at the cottage, doing other things, where Sam McLaughlin, as you heard, continued through the 50s, but then kept going in and out of General Motors through the 60s and the early 70s.
Clark's wondering, does Parkwood have any of Colonel Sam's cars? Because I know Automotive, we don't.
We do not have any vehicles.
Okay. I'm sure they're still out there. I wouldn't be surprised if there's a few Colonel Sam vehicles. But yeah, it occurs to me, I have no idea. Good question, Clark, where his actual cars ended up. Because he had quite a stable of them, didn't he?
Well, and he would get new ones frequently. So there was always the Sam car, and there was always the Adelaide car, actually, and they were often replaced.
One of his cars.
What's that?
Sorry, we do have one of his cars. We have the custom station wagon he had built for use at his estate in Bermuda.
Yes,
I believe that's the only verifiable owned and driven by Colonel Sam car we have, and it's a very strange piece of kit.
And from just public stories and from stories of family friends over the years, we do know that when Mr. McLaughlin was finished with his car that he had that year, he would often sell it to friends or gift them. So yeah, I'm sure they're still out there. A general question from Nancy. Do we know if Sam ever met with any of the prime ministers at the time, or any of the royals? Well, specifically, Her Majesty the Queen. Do we have any records of sort of royal visits to Parkwood? The royal visits to Parkwood, certainly in the earlier days. So we do have Edward was never at Parkwood, but they did associate usually at the Eglinton Hunt Club. So that would be Edward VIII before he abdicates. And then we have the Duke of Kent did come to Parkwood. And we do know during the 1939 royal tour, the McLaughlins, General Motors had custom made the car for them to tour in. So Sam and Adelaide did spend time with the royals in 1939. After, when the Queen Mom would visit often E.P. Taylor, she was very close with E.P. Taylor, Sam would see her at different times, usually at the Taylor estate in downtown Toronto.
Being told by Greg from Automotive that our 1971 Buick is apparently his last car.
Oh.
But the fact that he was getting a new car when he was 100, that speaks a bit to his car purchasing habits, I think. Let me see here. We're almost out of time, so I think one last question probably. Let me see what we've got here. Was Sam at all involved in Winfield Farms?
Well, not Winfield Farms, but the property was actually Parkwood Farm, and he sold it to E.P. Taylor in 1950. So it belonged to him beforehand. So it was his. And then as he thought he was aging in 1950, he sold the property.
So yeah, I mean, his involvement in the land that Oshawa is built on is tremendous.
Yeah.
I think we're going to have to, Alex is always very strict that we end right at 8 o'clock. So I think we're going to have to call it there, but thank you everybody for your wonderful questions and comments. This has been a really fascinating sort of deep dive into Oshawa history. And again, we have an ending slide with our contact information. Sorry, I got so caught up. I forgot about our slideshow entirely. But if you have questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to Sam or to reach out to Alex and I at Automotive. And thank you so much for your contributions. And Sam, thank you so much for joining us and for all this wonderful knowledge you've been sharing with us. This has been really fascinating.
My pleasure. And just before we end, just for people who don't recognize this is the McLaughlin family mausoleum at Union Cemetery.
Yeah, which is very understated. Doesn't really have big anything car related, anything McLaughlin related. It's pretty anonymous by the standards of very large mausoleums, anyway.
In black marble.
Yeah. Well,
good night, everyone.
Good night, everybody. Thank you so much. Have a great evening and take care, everybody.